December 24, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas, 300 miles northwest of Houston in the heart of Brazos County farmland. Hauptmann Klaus Richter stood behind the barbed wire fence watching American guards prepare for something he couldn't quite comprehend. Though the date itself carried weight that pressed against his chest like physical force. The compound held nearly 5,000 German prisoners of war, most captured in North Africa or the Western European theater after D-Day, men who'd believed they were fighting for something worth dying for, and had instead found themselves shipped across an ocean to a country that felt impossibly distant from everything they'd known. Richter had been a company commander in the Africa Corps, had fought at El Alamein where Rommel's forces had been shattered by Montgomery's 8th Army, had spent 18 months in British captivity before being transferred to American custody and sent to Texas, where the landscape reminded him painfully of the North African desert, except here there was no war, no purpose, just endless days of agricultural labor, picking cotton and harvesting sugar beets, while the war that had defined his adult life continued without him thousands of miles away. Around him stretched rows of wooden barracks painted in drab military green, guard towers at each corner manned by American soldiers who seemed impossibly young and well-fed, compared to the Wehrmacht troops Richter remembered from the final days in Africa. Watchtowers equipped with searchlights that would sweep across the compound each night, creating moving shadows that reminded prisoners they were captives even in sleep. What Richter didn't know, what none of the 5,000 men behind the wire could have anticipated as they prepared for another lonely Christmas separated from families and homeland, was that in less than 2 hours, American camp administrators would make a decision that would crack open something fundamental in these hardened combat veterans, would reduce grown men who'd survived artillery barrages and tank warfare to sobbing wrecks, clutching photographs of families they might never see again, would demonstrate that even in captivity, even among enemies, certain songs carried power that transcended nationality and touched something universal in the human experience of loss and longing. The story of how Christmas carols broke. German prisoners of war in American camps begins months earlier, in the spring and summer of 1944, when hundreds of thousands of German soldiers captured after the Normandy invasion and subsequent Allied advances began flooding into prisoner of war facilities across the United States. The American military had been preparing for this influx since 1943, when the first significant numbers of German POWs from the North African campaign arrived, but nobody had anticipated the sheer volume of captives that would result from the collapse of German defenses in France. By November 1944, over 280,000 German prisoners were being held in 132 base camps and 334 branch camps scattered across nearly every American state. Facilities that ranged from massive complexes in Texas and Oklahoma to small work camps in rural Wyoming and Colorado, where prisoners provided desperately needed agricultural labor to farms depleted of workers by military conscription. Camp Hearn represented the middle tier of this system, large enough to house several thousand prisoners, but small enough that relationships between captors and captives could develop beyond the purely institutional. The camp had been constructed rapidly in 1942 on land purchased from local farmers for $27,000. 720 acres of Texas prairie transformed into barracks, mess halls, administration buildings, and recreation facilities surrounded by double rows of barbed wire fence with guard towers spaced at intervals that allowed overlapping fields of fire should prisoners attempt escape. Most didn't try. By late 1944, the majority of German prisoners understood with varying degrees of acceptance that Germany was losing the war, that the Third Reich, which had promised thousand-year dominion over Europe, was collapsing under combined pressure from Soviet forces advancing from the east and Anglo-American armies closing from the west, that escape from American custody meant either dying in hostile territory or being recaptured, and possibly facing much harsher treatment than the relatively benign conditions they experienced in camps that followed Geneva Convention protocols. The food was adequate, sometimes better than what German soldiers had received in the final months before capture. The work assignments, while physically demanding, weren't designed to kill through exhaustion, the way forced labor operated in Nazi concentration camps. Mail service, though irregular and heavily censored, allowed prisoners to maintain some connection with families back home, though letters increasingly brought news of cities destroyed by Allied bombing, of relatives killed or missing, of a homeland being systematically dismantled by total war that consumed everything in its path. Among the 5,000 prisoners at Camp Herne that December, you could find representatives of nearly every stage of Germany's war. Veterans of Poland and France from the early Blitzkrieg victories who'd believed the war would be over in months. Survivors of the brutal Eastern Front who'd experienced combat at a scale and intensity that Western Front soldiers couldn't imagine. Afrika Korps troops who'd fought in the desert until supply lines collapsed and resistance became impossible. And increasingly those captured in France after D-Day who'd been thrown into combat with minimal training to replace casualties that Germany could no longer afford but couldn't stop hemorrhaging. Hauptmann Richter represented the middle generation, professional soldiers who'd made the Wehrmacht their career before Hitler took power and had watched with varying degrees of enthusiasm or resignation as the military became increasingly subordinated to Nazi political ideology. He'd never joined the Nazi Party, had considered National Socialism a vulgar populist movement that appealed to the worst instincts of the German masses. But he'd taken his oath to the Führer and had believed that military professionalism meant executing orders regardless of personal political views. The cognitive dissonance this created had been manageable during victories in Poland and France. But by El Alamein in late 1942, when British artillery had pounded German positions for hours before Montgomery's infantry advanced behind overwhelming material superiority, Richter had begun understanding that Germany had started a war it couldn't win against enemies, with resources that dwarfed anything the Third Reich could mobilize. Capture had brought relief mixed with shame. Relief that he'd survived when so many hadn't. Shame that he was sitting in a Texas prison camp, eating 3 meals daily, while his comrades continued fighting and dying in battles that increasingly resembled suicide missions. The other prisoners reflected similar psychological states. Some remained fanatically loyal to Hitler and National Socialism, refused to accept that Germany could lose, organized Nazi cells within the camps that intimidated and sometimes murdered prisoners who expressed defeatist views or collaborated too willingly with American authorities. Others had abandoned all faith in the Nazi cause, recognized the war as a catastrophic mistake that had destroyed Germany's future, secretly welcomed defeat as the only way to end the insanity that had consumed their nation. Most existed in between, men who'd done their duty as they understood it, who'd fought bravely because that's what soldiers did, who now found themselves prisoners without clear purpose, while the world they'd known disintegrated thousands of miles away. The Christmas season of 1944 represented a particularly cruel psychological challenge for these men because Christmas, in German culture, carried emotional weight that Americans might struggle to fully comprehend. Wasn't just a religious holiday or commercial festival, but a profound expression of family, unity and cultural identity that reached back through centuries of tradition to pre-Christian winter solstice celebrations that Christianity had absorbed and transformed. The German Christmas began weeks before December 25th, with Advent calendars and wreaths, with markets selling handcrafted ornaments and gingerbread, with families gathering to sing carols that every German child learned from earliest memory. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, the carol Americans knew as Silent Night, had been composed in Austria in 1818 and had become perhaps the most universally recognized German contribution to world music, a song that captured something essential about the German spirit's capacity for sentiment and reverence. O Tannenbaum celebrated the Christmas tree tradition that had originated in Germany and spread globally, while O du Fröhliche expressed joy at Christ's birth with melody and lyrics that even non-religious Germans could sing from memory. These weren't just songs, they were sonic touchstones that connected Germans across time and space to shared cultural identity, reminded them of childhood Christmases when the world had been comprehensible and safe, when their fathers hadn't yet died in the trenches of World War I and their nation hadn't yet descended into the totalitarian nightmare of National Socialism and another catastrophic world war. For prisoners of war thousands of miles from home, with no certainty they'd ever return, With families that might already be dead under Allied bombing or Soviet occupation, Christmas wasn't a celebration, but a reminder of everything they'd lost and might never recover. Most camps had made some accommodation for the holiday. German cooks were given extra rations to prepare traditional meals. Prisoners organized Christmas pageants and concerts in camp auditoriums. The YMCA distributed Christmas parcels that had been shipped months earlier to arrive in time. But no amount of organized activity could mask the fundamental reality that these men were separated from everything that made Christmas meaningful, were marking the holiday as captives of the enemy in a foreign land while their homeland burned. At Camp Hearn on the evening of December 24, 1944, as temperature dropped toward freezing, unusual for Texas, but welcome to men who associated Christmas with winter cold, American camp commander Colonel William Hartley convened his staff to discuss whether they should permit prisoners to celebrate Christmas Eve in ways that might create security concerns. The debate reflected tensions that existed throughout the American prisoner of war system between humanitarian treatment, mandated by Geneva Convention protocols, and security concerns, driven by the reality that these were enemy soldiers who might attempt escape or organize resistance if given too much freedom. Hartley had been career Army, had served in World War I, had seen German prisoners in that earlier conflict, and understood that soldiers remained dangerous, even behind barbed wire, if they retained organizational cohesion and leadership. Some of his guards had fought in Europe, had lost friends to German fire, harbored resentments that made supervising prisoners psychologically difficult because every instinct said these were the enemy who deserved nothing but harsh treatment. But Hartley also understood that brutalizing prisoners created security problems rather than solving them, that men treated with relative decency were easier to manage than men pushed to desperation, that the United States had strategic interest in demonstrating to neutral observers and to world opinion that American treatment of prisoners exemplified civilized values even in total war. The compromise reached that evening would prove more significant than anyone anticipated. Prisoners would be permitted to gather in the main assembly hall for a Christmas Eve program. German prisoners could organize their own entertainment, including singing carols in their native language, and in a gesture that seemed minor at the time, American guards would participate by playing recorded Christmas music on the camp public address system before the German program began. The chaplain had suggested that starting with familiar carols might create atmosphere of shared humanity despite the circumstances, might remind both guards and prisoners that certain traditions transcended national boundaries and even the enmity of war. Nobody considered that this decision would trigger emotional breakdowns that would leave hundreds of prisoners sobbing uncontrollably, would force American guards to confront the human cost of war in ways that combat rarely allowed, would create moments of connection between enemies that both sides would remember decades later as more profound than most of their actual combat experiences. The mechanics were simple. The camp PA system would play recordings of Silent Night, "O Come All Ye Faithful," and other carols familiar to both American and German audiences. Instrumental versions without English or German lyrics, so prisoners could sing in their own language if they chose. Then the program would transition to German prisoners performing their own celebration, whatever combination of songs and readings they'd organized. Simple enough, a minor accommodation to holiday sentiment, nothing that suggested the psychological avalanche it would trigger. When the first notes of Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht echoed through the camp public address system at 1900 hours on Christmas Eve 1944, Hauptmann Klaus Richter was standing near the assembly hall entrance with several hundred other prisoners who'd gathered despite ambivalence about celebrating Christmas in captivity. And what happened in the next minutes would remain the most emotionally devastating experience of his entire war, including combat actions where he'd seen men killed and had believed he would die himself. The melody began softly, just the instrumental arrangement without words, but every German prisoner recognized those opening notes instantly, because they'd heard that song every Christmas since childhood, had sung it with parents and siblings, and later with their own families, had heard it in churches and town squares, and around Christmas trees decorated with candles and homemade ornaments that represented continuity with past generations, stretching back before anyone could remember. For Richter, the effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Transported him instantly to Christmas, 1933, in München, where he'd stood with his wife and young daughter in the Marienplatz listening to carolers while snow fell, and everything had seemed possible for Germany. Despite the economic collapse and political chaos, that Christmas his daughter had been 3 years old, had gripped his hand and stared wide-eyed at the enormous tree and the lights and the singers, had asked in that way children do whether the angels were real and would they bring presents. 11 years later in Texas, Richter didn't know if his daughter was still alive because München had been bombed repeatedly, and mail from home had become increasingly unreliable, and the last letter he'd received 3 months earlier from his wife had mentioned air raids, but nothing specific enough to know whether they'd survived. The song brought all of that crashing down on him simultaneously. The memory of his daughter's face in the Marienplatz, the uncertainty about whether she lived or had died under British or American bombs, the recognition that even if she survived, he might never see her again because nobody could predict how long the war would continue or what would happen to prisoners when it finally ended. Around him, similar emotional avalanches were occurring in hundreds of individual consciousnesses as the carol triggered memories and associations that prisoners had been suppressing through the emotional discipline required to survive imprisonment. Men who'd maintained stoic composure through months or years of captivity, who'd successfully compartmentalized their emotions to avoid the psychological breakdown that constant homesickness and uncertainty could induce, suddenly found their defenses completely shattered by a simple Christmas carol that connected them to everything they'd lost and might never recover. The emotional breakdown began in isolated pockets. Individual prisoners who suddenly couldn't maintain control, who sank to their knees or doubled over as if physically struck, who began sobbing with intensity that suggested physical pain rather than simple sadness. Oberfeldwebel Hans Müller, veteran of the Eastern Front who'd fought at Stalingrad and had been captured in France after surviving combat that had killed nearly everyone from his original company, collapsed against the barracks wall and wept so violently that guards initially thought he was having some kind of seizure. Müller had grown up in a small farming village in Bavaria, where Christmas had been the most important celebration of the year, where the entire village would gather in the church on Christmas Eve to sing carols before midnight mass, where his mother had prepared traditional meals and his father had carved wooden toys for the children. He'd lost his entire family when British bombers destroyed the village in a raid targeting nearby industrial facilities, had learned this through a Red Cross notification 4 months earlier, delivered with bureaucratic efficiency that made the tragedy feel surreal and impossible to fully process. The carol forced him to process what he'd been avoiding, forced him to confront that his mother and father and 2 younger sisters were dead, that the village where he'd grown up no longer existed, that the life he'd imagined returning to after the war had been erased as completely as if it had never existed. Other prisoners near Müller began breaking down in sympathy or triggered by their own suppressed grief and fear, creating cascading emotional contagion that spread through the assembled prisoners faster than conscious thought could track. Feldwebel Otto Schneider, who'd maintained reputation as one of the hardest men in camp, someone who intimidated other prisoners with his fanatical National Socialist beliefs and his willingness to punish anyone who showed weakness or defeatist attitudes, found himself weeping uncontrollably while trying desperately to hide his face, because crying contradicted everything he'd claimed to believe about German strength and warrior virtue. Schneider represented the most ideologically committed segment of the prisoner population, men who'd joined the Nazi Party before the war, who'd believed completely in Hitler's vision of German racial supremacy and thousand-year Reich, who'd volunteered for combat duty and fought with fanatical determination even as military situation became hopeless. These hardcore Nazis had organized cells within American camps, enforced discipline on fellow prisoners through intimidation and violence, maintained Nazi rituals and celebrations despite American prohibitions, identified and sometimes murdered prisoners suspected of collaboration with American authorities. Schneider had personally participated in the beating death of a prisoner, suspected of informing camp administrators about escape planning, had shown no remorse when questioned by American investigators, because he considered the victim a traitor to Germany who deserved execution. But now he stood sobbing while O. Tannenbaum played through the speakers, tears streaming down his face as he remembered Christmas 1938 in Berlin, where he'd celebrated with his SS unit, where they'd sung carols and exchanged gifts and toasted the Führer's health, while believing they were part of something historic and glorious that would reshape Europe and the world. That night his commander had given a speech about how National Socialism was creating new German Christmas traditions that honored racial heritage and warrior virtues, about how they were the vanguard of a movement that would last centuries. 6 years later, everything that speech had promised lay in ruins. Germany was being crushed between Soviet armies from the east and Anglo-American forces from the west. The cities Schneider had known were being systematically destroyed by strategic bombing, and he stood in a Texas prison camp crying over a Christmas carol that reminded him of everything he'd believed and everything that had been lost. The cognitive dissonance created unbearable psychological tension because Nazi ideology demanded absolute faith and showed no mercy for doubt or weakness. But the music had bypassed ideology completely and connected directly to emotional memories from before National Socialism had consumed his life. Reminded him of childhood Christmases when his mother sang carols and his father brought home a tree and everything had been simple and safe before politics and war had complicated everything. The music continued, moved to O du Fröhliche, then to Es ist ein Rosensprung, each carol adding layers to the emotional storm that was consuming the assembled prisoners. By the time the recorded music had been playing for 15 minutes, more than half the prisoners in the assembly area were crying openly, some silently with tears streaming down faces. They tried unsuccessfully to keep composed, others sobbing with sounds that carried across the compound and reached guards in their towers who looked down at the scene with expressions mixing confusion and discomfort, and in some cases their own suppressed emotion, because they too were far from home on Christmas Eve thinking about families they hadn't seen in months or years. The crying wasn't uniform or organized, wasn't a collective response that suggested planning or manipulation, but rather hundreds of individual emotional breakdowns happening simultaneously, each prisoner confronting his own specific losses and fears and memories that the music had awakened. Some men cried for dead comrades, friends killed in combat, whose faces they saw whenever they closed their eyes. Others cried for families they'd abandoned when they'd been conscripted or volunteered for service, wives and children they'd promised to return to, but who now might be dead or might survive but never forgive the absence. Still others cried from sheer exhaustion, emotional and physical weariness accumulated through years of war that had demanded constant alertness and suppression of natural human vulnerability. The camp had become a temporary community where men shared space and routine but rarely shared genuine emotional connection, because vulnerability was dangerous in an environment where Nazi enforcers punished perceived weakness and where maintaining dignity meant not showing the enemy how completely capture had broken you. But the music had shattered those barriers completely, had created a moment where pretense became impossible and every man's true emotional state was visible to everyone around him. American guards watching this mass emotional breakdown struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing, because they'd been trained to view German prisoners primarily as security threats, as enemy soldiers who might attempt escape or organize resistance, not as human beings capable of the kind of devastating vulnerability that was now on display throughout the assembly area. Lieutenant Robert Morrison, Camp Hearn's assistant security officer, who'd fought in North Africa and Sicily before being reassigned to prisoner of war administration, stood at the edge of the crowd watching hundreds of grown men cry and felt something shift in his understanding of the war and the enemy he'd been fighting. Morrison had lost his younger brother in the Battle of Monte Cassino, where German defenders had turned the monastery and surrounding hills into a killing ground that had taken months of brutal combat to overcome, had carried rage toward Germans that made working as a prison guard psychologically difficult, because every instinct said these men deserved vengeance, not humane treatment. He'd requested the prisoner of war assignment specifically because he wanted to see defeated Germans, wanted to witness their humiliation and be part of the system that kept them captive as partial compensation for his brother, who died screaming in a minefield while German being Machine guns cut down anyone who tried to help. For Morrison, the war had been personal in ways that made professional detachment impossible, had been about avenging his brother and punishing the nation that had killed him. And working at Camp Herne had provided opportunities to exercise petty cruelties that never quite satisfied, but represented the only revenge available to him. But watching Hauptmann Richter lean against a fence post, crying with such intensity that his entire body shook, watching tough combat veterans reduced to children by a simple song, Morrison couldn't maintain the emotional distance that made hating the enemy possible. These weren't the monsters Nazi propaganda portrayed Germans as, nor the supermen German propaganda claimed for the Wehrmacht. They were just men who'd been caught in circumstances beyond their control, who'd fought because their nation demanded it, who now found themselves separated from everything familiar while their homeland was being destroyed in a war most of them no longer believed Germany could win. The recognition didn't erase Morrison's grief for his brother or his anger at the Nazi regime that had started the war, but it complicated those feelings in ways he'd spend years trying to reconcile. He found himself thinking about his brother's letters from Italy, where he'd described German prisoners his unit had captured, had mentioned how young many of them looked and how some cried when questioned about their families. Morrison had dismissed those observations at the time as dangerous sentimentality that could get soldiers killed if they started thinking of the enemy as human. But now, witnessing the Christmas Eve breakdown, he understood what his brother had been trying to communicate. That war created suffering on all sides, and that recognizing that suffering didn't mean abandoning moral clarity about who started the war or which side represented better values. Other guards responded differently to the spectacle unfolding before them. Some maintained professional detachment, treated the mass crying as just another security situation to monitor for potential disruption, moved through the crowd ensuring nobody was attempting to use the emotional chaos as cover for escape or violence. These were career soldiers who'd learned to compartmentalize emotion, who'd processed their own combat trauma by building walls between feeling and action, who viewed any emotional response to prisoners as weakness that undermined military discipline. A few guards felt satisfaction at seeing the enemy brought low, interpreted the breakdown as confirmation that German military prowess had been propaganda and that American material and moral superiority was crushing Nazi resistance at every level, including psychological. These men had fought Germans in Europe, had seen American soldiers killed by German fire, had developed hatred that watching prisoners cry only intensified because it seemed like weakness they wished they'd seen in combat when it might have saved American lives. Still other guards found themselves crying alongside prisoners, either from homesickness triggered by the Christmas music or from empathy with the prisoners' obvious suffering, or from sheer emotional exhaustion accumulated through years of war that had demanded constant suppression of natural human responses to violence and loss. Corporal James Henderson from rural Georgia had been listening to Silent Night and thinking about his wife and two daughters, whom he hadn't seen since his deployment in 1943, had been imagining them decorating their tree and singing carols and wondering if he'd ever get home to celebrate Christmas with them again. And when he saw the German prisoners breaking down, emotionally he recognized his own suppressed fear and loneliness, reflected in their tears, and found himself sobbing along with enemy soldiers, while his fellow guards looked at him with expressions ranging from understanding to contempt. The German prisoner response to this emotional breakdown revealed divisions within the camp population that American authorities had been monitoring but hadn't fully appreciated in their psychological complexity and their implications for post-war Germany. The hardcore Nazis like Feldwebel Schneider struggled to reconcile their emotional response with their ideological commitments, found themselves crying over Christmas carols while simultaneously hating themselves for weakness that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught about German racial superiority and warrior strength. These men would often lash out afterward at prisoners who'd cried openly, would accuse them of defeatism and cowardice, would sometimes resort to violence against those they perceived as having betrayed German dignity by displaying emotion in front of American captors. In the days following Christmas Eve, camp administrators documented several assaults on prisoners that appeared motivated by resentment over the public crying. Incidents where Nazi enforcers beat men they accused of weakness or collaboration, where the shame of having themselves broken down emotionally was redirected as rage against others who'd done the same. The violence reflected deep psychological conflict within the Nazi true believers who'd structured their entire identities around ideology that demanded superhuman strength and showed contempt for normal human emotion, who now had to process having displayed exactly the kind of weakness they'd been taught to despise. Some of these men never recovered psychologically, remained bitter and violent, and committed to National Socialism through their remaining time in American custody and even after repatriation, joined neo-Nazi movements in post-war Germany, and spent decades trying to resurrect the ideology that had given their lives meaning, even as it destroyed their nation. Others began slow process of disillusionment, started questioning beliefs they'd held with religious fervor, used the emotional breakdown as catalyst for examining whether Nazi ideology had been lie that had exploited their idealism and led them into catastrophe. The anti-Nazis, prisoners who'd been social democrats or communists before 1933, or who'd become disillusioned with National Socialism through combat experience or through witnessing Nazi atrocities in occupied territories, felt liberation in the emotional release, treated the breakdown as confirmation that Nazi ideology's demand for constant strength and suppression of natural human feeling had been psychologically destructive lie. These men had often been persecuted before the war, had spent time in concentration camps, or had been forced to flee Germany, had served in Wehrmacht because conscription gave them no choice but had never believed in the cause they were fighting for. For them, the Christmas Eve crying represented moment of authentic humanity, breaking through the dehumanizing system that Nazism had created, represented possibility that German culture could be separated from Nazi ideology, and that post-war Germany might rebuild on foundations that honored traditional values like family and community rather than racial supremacy and aggressive militarism. The vast majority of prisoners existed between these ideological extremes, men who'd served Germany without strong political commitment, who'd fought because that's what citizens did when their nation was at war, who'd absorbed Nazi propaganda without becoming fanatical believers, who now found themselves emotional wrecks crying over Christmas carols because the music connected them to families and homeland they desperately missed but had no control over whether they'd ever see again. For many prisoners, regardless of their political orientation, the experience created lasting psychological trauma because it forced confrontation with suppressed grief and fear that they'd been managing through emotional discipline that the music had completely shattered. Sleep that night was difficult for most. Men lying in their bunks, reliving the emotional storm and trying to rebuild psychological defenses that would allow them to continue functioning in captivity without breaking down constantly. Some prisoners drew strength from the shared experience, felt bonds with fellow prisoners who'd all been vulnerable together in ways that combat never quite created, because in combat you could maintain illusion of control through action. But in the grip of overwhelming emotion, triggered by familiar music, there was no action possible, just surrender to feelings that couldn't be resisted or controlled. Others felt shame and embarrassment, believed they'd displayed weakness that diminished their dignity and their standing within the prisoner hierarchy, withdrew from social interaction, and became more isolated in attempt to avoid reminder of their emotional vulnerability. The camp's medical staff noticed increase in reported depression and anxiety symptoms in the weeks following Christmas, more prisoners requesting sleeping medication or reporting physical symptoms that had psychological origins, suggesting that the emotional breakthrough had opened wounds that many prisoners weren't psychologically equipped to process in healthy ways. The aftermath of that Christmas Eve emotional breakdown at Camp Hearn and similar scenes that occurred throughout the American prisoner of war system created lasting impacts that extended beyond the immediate psychological experience of prisoners and guards who witnessed or participated in these moments. For American military authorities responsible for managing hundreds of thousands of German prisoners across more than 400 facilities, the incidents forced recognition that prisoner of war administration wasn't just logistics and security, but required understanding psychological dynamics that could create security problems or opportunities for demonstrating American values in ways that might influence post-war German society. The Special Projects Division responsible for prisoner re-education began incorporating music and cultural programming into their efforts to expose German prisoners to democratic values and non-Nazi German cultural traditions, believing that creating emotional connections to pre-Nazi German culture might help undermine continued loyalty to National socialism among prisoners who would eventually return home and participate in rebuilding Germany. Some camps organized prisoner orchestras and theater groups, provided instruments through YMCA programs, encouraged prisoners to maintain cultural traditions that weren't specifically Nazi in origin, created libraries with German literature that predated Nazi period to remind prisoners their nation had cultural heritage that existed independent of Hitler's regime. The success of these programs varied wildly, depending on camp dynamics and the ideological composition of prisoner populations and the quality of American personnel administering them. But they represented recognition that psychological warfare didn't end with combat, that winning the peace required winning hearts and minds of defeated populations who would eventually return home to determine whether post-war Germany would embrace democracy or slide back into authoritarian nationalism. The Christmas Carol incident provided evidence that emotional appeals could penetrate defenses, that rational arguments couldn't breach, that men who rejected American political lecturing about democracy might still be reached through cultural experiences that reminded them of common humanity and shared values that transcended national boundaries. For the prisoners themselves, the experience became defining memory that many carried for the rest of their lives. Moment when the psychological barriers they'd constructed to survive combat and imprisonment had collapsed completely and left them vulnerable in ways they'd never forgotten. Hauptmann Klaus Richter survived the war, was repatriated to Germany in 1946, discovered his wife and daughter had survived the bombing of München, though their home had been destroyed, and they'd spent final months of war as refugees. He never forgot Christmas Eve 1944 in Texas, would tell his daughter decades later that hearing Stille Nacht in that camp had been the most emotionally devastating moment of his life because it had forced him to confront how completely war had destroyed everything he'd believed was permanent and how uncertain he'd been that he'd ever see her again. Oberfeldwebel Hans Müller returned to Bavaria to find the village where he'd grown up still in ruins. The bomb craters filled in, but the buildings never rebuilt because the younger generation had moved to cities for work. He lived another 40 years, never married, worked as carpenter, spoke rarely about the war but mentioned to friends that Christmas 1944 in American captivity, when he'd broken down crying over carols, had been the night he'd finally accepted that his family was truly gone and that the life he'd known would never return. Feldwebel Otto Schneider remained committed Nazi after repatriation, joined neo-Nazi groups in 1950s West Germany, was arrested several times for political violence, died in 1967 still believing Hitler had been right and that Germany's defeat had been betrayal rather than inevitable result of launching war it couldn't win. But even Schneider apparently mentioned the Christmas Eve breakdown in letters seized by police, wrote about how the American playing of German carols had been psychological warfare designed to break German prisoner morale and that his crying that night had been moment of weakness he'd spent years trying to atone for through continued commitment to National Socialist principles. For American guards, the experience also left lasting impressions that complicated their understanding of war and enemy. Lieutenant Robert Morrison continued military career after war, served in Korea, eventually retired as colonel, and in interviews conducted by military historians in the 1980s, he identified Christmas Eve 1944 at Camp Herne as moment that changed how he thought about combat and enemy soldiers, said watching German prisoners break down crying over Christmas carols had made him realize that war created suffering on scale that transcended questions of who was right or wrong, that even just wars produced casualties and trauma that affected everyone involved regardless of which side they fought for. He never abandoned his belief that fighting Nazi Germany had been necessary and morally justified, never regretted his service, or stopped grieving for his brother killed at Monte Cassino, but he carried for rest of his life the memory of German prisoners crying, and the recognition that they too had been human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control rather than simply evil enemies who deserved whatever suffering war inflicted on them. The incident became case study in military psychology programs, was referenced in training materials for prisoner of war administration, appeared in academic papers about music's psychological impact, and about cultural connections that persist even in warfare between enemies. Historians studying the American prisoner of war system identified Christmas 1944 as turning point when American authorities began emphasizing re-education and cultural programming rather than simple detention, when the recognition emerged that how America treated German prisoners might influence whether post-war Germany became democratic ally or remained bitter enemy. The emotional breakthrough triggered by Christmas carols demonstrated that reaching German prisoners required understanding their psychology and culture, required creating experiences that reminded them of values and traditions that existed independent of Nazi ideology, required recognizing them as human beings capable of change rather than simply defeated enemies to be controlled until war's end. Whether the re-education programs actually influenced post-war German development remains debated by historians who note that Allied occupation policies and economic reconstruction and Cold War pressures probably mattered more than prisoner of war experiences in determining Germany's democratic transformation. But the Christmas Carol incidents demonstrated that even in total war against regime as evil as Nazi Germany, moments of shared humanity could emerge that reminded combatants on both sides that their enemies were human beings, like themselves caught in historical forces that individuals couldn't control or fully comprehend. And that recognition of shared humanity didn't require abandoning moral clarity about whose cause was just, but did require acknowledging that war's suffering extended beyond simple categories of victim and perpetrator to encompass everyone touched by violence that modern industrial warfare inflicted with devastating efficiency on soldiers and civilians across all combatant nations.